means. Like, what does it mean to say that your culture is not allowing you to implement Agile? What does that really mean? How do you know what aspects of your culture are holding you back? And so what we did with Agile 2 was we tried to tackle these questions head on, because we think that while Agile's really good in many ways, there were some really important new ideas there. It's been 20 years and they're not really mature and they're not dealt with effectively. So what we did was identify initially some things that we thought were not going so well. And then we talked about the things that are going so well. And we chose the name Agile 2 because we are firmly rooted in the Agile arena. And so here's a list of things that Agile really helped us tackle 20 years ago when it emerged, right? It dealt with the problem of phased software development, doing things in a waterfall fashion, trying to build something all at once in one effort versus doing it incrementally. It dealt with the micromanaging of teams. So there were a lot of really good things that Agile brought to the world of software development 20 years ago. But then over time, some new narratives emerged that were not so healthy for the field. So one idea is that everything is about the team and that all teams should be self-organizing and autonomous, and that teams don't really need leaders except for maybe someone to remove impediments. And that everyone needed to sit together and communicate all the time. Even remotely, people are expected to pay attention to Slack and communicate with each other all the time. And then there's some other things that really were promoted and developed by the Agile community. They weren't necessarily part of the original Agile manifesto. It might have been misinterpreted or misimplied, but they became sort of entrenched ideas like written communication is not important, right? Because we talk about valuing working software over comprehensive documentation. And so written materials were devalued and minimized. And this idea that if Agile isn't working, it's the people's fault, the organization's fault, that people aren't doing it right, that if they would only do Agile correctly, it would work. And so it's this feeling of, you can't really criticize it, because if you criticize it, it means you're not doing it correctly. And there was just several ideas that emerged in the Agile community that were just really harmful. And the challenge with these ideas is that they're called Agile best practices or Agile beliefs or whatever, but they're not necessarily truly Agile. And they may not even be consistent with the Agile manifesto. I mean, the Agile manifesto has some real balance in it. And over time, what happened was that balance was lost. And this came out in 2012. So it's not like suddenly we just realized that Agile is not working. People have been thinking about this a lot. And this is when at this time, people were saying, look, you're telling us how to do everything, and it's very prescriptive. And the caveat itself, which I think is very important, was rewritten to say that since there is no value in the items on the right, we value only the items on the left. And that's a common misunderstanding of the Agile manifesto. The other thing that happened was that some things were left out of the manifesto. There was a whole lot of knowledge and expertise in the 1990s that just somehow didn't get in there for a variety of reasons. One example is business data. The company MicroStrategy was founded in 1989, and its focus was intelligence based on analyzing business data. So back in 2001, data was really important. The manifesto doesn't mention data. And unfortunately, because of the way that the manifesto was interpreted, things that were left out were kind of ignored. Now, the manifesto itself didn't claim to be the be all and the end all, but it was how it was interpreted, how it was applied or misapplied that got the Agile community into trouble. And today, data is more important than ever, right? In some ways, you could say that data is more important than code. And methodologies that claim to be Agile don't really talk about data for the most part, except for feature-driven development. But I will ask you this: how many people have heard that the data their teams push to the data lake is unusable for machine learning? My business partner, Cliff, says he hears that a lot. And that's because no one is telling the teams that when they use Scrum, they also need to figure out how to use Agile modeling techniques or domain-driven design, and that maintaining enterprise data models is essential if you want to leverage your data as an asset for business intelligence. Now, I won't say that this is because the team members don't know this, right? But when you're using Scrum, the focus is often on creating features and pushing out features really quickly, and data is kind of an afterthought. Now, I said this before, that a lot of people think Agile is equivalent to Scrum, or at best, they think that Agile is a process. I mean, people will say to me, I need you to teach me the Agile process. Or, Lisa, can you just teach me how Agile works and leave out the theory? And I get frustrated because that's sort of a disservice to Agile. To me, it's not just a process. It's a very important way of thinking, and it's a set of values and principles. And it's important to teach those and not just think of it as a process. Now, DevOps was originally conceived by Agilists, and some of these negative ideas about Agile that I described to you earlier kind of hold DevOps back in a way. The Agile community focuses on scaling Agile using processes like Scrum or Scrum at Scale and adapting them into, really elaborate models like you've probably seen, SAFe, for example. But DevOps really does allow you to scale Agile. And so DevOps is starting to, or already has gotten traction all on its own, kind of bypassing Agile and leaving it behind because DevOps is so effective. So the original idea behind DevOps, when the Phoenix project came out and everything, was that it was really people-oriented, right? It was to combine development and operations. And Nicole Forsgren in the book Accelerate shows that adopting DevOps correlates with higher morale and good leadership. But the reality of DevOps is a little different than its original articulation. It's very technical, and it doesn't necessarily address culture head-on directly first, right? As DevOps is practiced, it's more about workflow and lean techniques and testing and operations. And so I think DevOps is not quite ready to replace Agile, but I do think DevOps is critically important because it provides many of the missing technical elements that Agile needs to be successful. And the other reason I think DevOps can't replace Agile completely on its own is because DevOps doesn't contain theories of human behavior. In fact, when I was asked to give this talk, I was asked specifically to focus on culture, and that's where Agile 2 comes in. So at this point, you might be thinking, okay, so all these things are wrong with Agile, and what should we do? What is the alternative? We have DevOps, and we love that, but we also know that there's culture issues and like, oh no, what are we going to do? So first of all, there are a lot of people who have written books about this, and there are a lot of ideas related to this that can guide thinking and help move things forward. So what Agile 2 is an articulation of many of these types of thinkers. And not all of them are standard Agile topics. Some of them are about things that are related to doing the kind of work that we do, but they're more general books about psychology or about business management or about humans and their need to focus, the power of introverts and things like that. So I often get asked, what's the difference between, Agile 2 and Agile? And we call it classic Agile. And we think that classic Agile really struggles to work for a large organization, and Agile 2 can work. In classic Agile, there's excessive focus on just the team. And in Agile 2, we focus on the product and the entire ecosystem and on leadership. Classic Agile is kind of anti-management, this idea that every team should be self-organizing. And in Agile 2, we think that good leadership, the right kinds of leadership, is really important. Classic Agile, and here I'm referring specifically to ideas that became entrenched in the Agile community, not necessarily to what's in the Agile manifesto, that short little document, but to the whole, Agile industrial complex, if you will, right? Got sort of attached to these kind of rigid extremes, like Scrum has to be done a certain way. If you don't do it that way, you're not doing Scrum, you're doing something else, or you're doing it wrong, right? And in Agile 2, we think that nuance and context really matter a lot. Classic Agile is not really that technical. Talks about software development, but it doesn't orient itself around technical practices. And Agile 2 relies heavily on the very detailed practices of DevOps. And finally, classic Agile, unfortunately, is often equated with Scrum, and Scrum is equated with Agile. And instead, in Agile 2, we focus more on flow. So this is just a little example of the difference between classic Agile and Agile 2. In classic Agile, what ends up happening many times, not that anyone wanted it this way at the beginning when they wrote the manifesto, but what ends up happening is that the product owner and the business people don't really know how the product is built. They don't really understand what's going on. And in Agile 2, we think that it's really important that everyone has a high level understanding of the value stream, how new features are added, and the trade-offs, the hard decisions that have to be made between quality, time to market, and automation. So many people think DevOps is just a technical practice and that a company can just hire a good DevOps engineer and they're good to go, right? But that is very far from the case, as probably all of you know. For DevOps to work, you really have to apply to the entire value stream and not just for, dev teams or some small teams here and there in the organization. It's really essential for people in different parts of the value stream to be able to have deeply meaningful conversations. And they can only really do that if they understand enough about each other's domain. And what is the biggest impediment to DevOps? Culture. I hear this again and again from my friends in the DevOps community that, they'll get into a situation and they'll get everything set up technically, right? And they have all the people in place that they need, but then, things just still aren't working. And it's just the people, right? It's just the people getting in the way. So I really believe that old Agile will not work unless the organization's culture permits and supports it. And what we've done with Agile 2 is we've created a much clearer model for how to, be Agile, right? And a model that links to organizational culture. Okay. So before I'm going to go any farther, I'm going to ask you all to take a little poll. So go to this link. You can go to pollev.com and just enter Lisa Cooney 314, and you'll see a series of questions, and you can go through and answer them. I'm going to be quiet for a bit because they are thoughtful questions, and I'd like you to take a minute to go ahead and answer them. Please let me know or indicate in the chat if you're having trouble accessing the poll.
And I posted a link to the poll in the chat as well. This is the point where I almost wish I had some background music set up to play, but unless Christina, you have something like that ready to go, we'll just let it be quiet for a little bit.
If I had my setup, Victoria, you know I would be popping the jams on right now as we speak. But unfortunately, we're just gonna have to enjoy the pause and silence for just a moment.
Yeah, you'll have to let me know what your setup is later so I can get up to speed.
But great presentation so far, Lisa. My apologies, I'm not on camera right now, but I'm in sales and tech, so I really appreciate how I actually understand a lot of the concepts on this. Of course, it's very non-technical in my opinion, but very cool to see it kind of broken down in this way.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions you have now or later if you want to talk some more. So I see we have, let's see, we have 25 participants and we have 14 people able to access the poll. Let me know if you're having any trouble getting into the link to answer the questions. I'm going to go ahead and share my, go ahead.
I got an error. It says my response was not submitted, but then it also says all done, thanks for responding.
Oh,
I'm
sorry.
It probably worked though.
Thanks for letting me know. I don't know. Now we've got about 18 people in the poll. I'm going to share my screen again. So it's just showing me that these are the folks in the poll. It's anonymous, so.
Very cool visuals, Lisa. I've heard something similar to this, but never really seen it in action like this before.
Yeah.
And can you tell us more about the questions that you asked? I know that you all, you have an extensive kind of surveying tool related. Maybe that's what you plan to talk about next, but.
Yeah, I'm just waiting a couple more minutes so as not to distract folks who are finishing up. But then we'll take a look at these, yeah. Let's see, if I go to present, if I click on present, there we go. Just have a few people who are finishing up. I'm going to assume that those folks are on the last couple of questions, so I'll go ahead. So rather than just tell you about the assessment tools that we use, I thought it would be cool to actually have you take a little mini assessment yourself so you could see what it looks like. We have 3 general categories that we assess: culture, DevOps, and alignment with the Agile 2 principles. So this is one of the culture questions, and the actual surveys have a lot of questions. They take about 45 minutes to fill out each, right? So we would spread them out over several weeks. But this question gets at how authority is handled within the organization. And it's an indicator of organizational cultural health, because in the sense that when someone has authority and they have an idea, then others who have less authority may feel like they must agree with that idea just because the other person has more authority, right? You probably all heard the Hippo rule: highest individual, or what is it? Highest paid person's opinion. And so when this is the case, and I see that 44% of you so far responded to a great extent. So what that means is that the people with the most authority, their opinions and their ideas and their decisions are supposed to be backed up. And people feel like that's really important. And that's what's expected of them when they work in that organization. And what that does, obviously, is that stifles dissenting opinion, right? There might only be one dissenting voice about something, but that person may have an area of expertise or a very specific experience in the past that is vitally important to bring to the group. And if everyone is expected to back up those with authority, then those ideas don't emerge and get discussed. All right, let's look at the next one. This one asks about cooperation between different groups and departments on how well they work together in terms of working together on tasks that are in fact interdependent. And I'm glad to see 25% of you work in organizations where this is the case, but then 19% disagree and 31% slightly agree. Now, this question, by the way, comes from an organization called Human Synergistics that has been in the business of creating culture surveys for about 50 years. They really know what they're doing. And so obviously, I chose this one because it's so closely related to DevOps, right? If people aren't cooperating and communicating when their work is interdependent, how are you going to succeed? It makes it really, really hard to succeed. So if I were to run this survey within an organization, and let's say in that particular organization, a lot of people disagreed with this statement, that would be an indicator that there's something going on culturally within that organization that's blocking the effectiveness of DevOps. Okay, so this next question is relevant to the Agile 2 principle. Senior leaders get the right people together to resolve cross-functional issues that go beyond the individual or team level. And 25% of you do not enjoy that in your organization, but it's nice to see many of you, 62% of you agree or slightly agree. All right, another question. This is a core principle for Agile 2, is how important it is for business leaders to have a good understanding. It doesn't mean they have to become engineers, doesn't mean they have to know every technical aspect, but they do need to have a pretty decent understanding so that they can make good business decisions. So in organizations where most of the people say agree or slightly agree, that's great, right? But in organizations where like the 13% who said disagree, those types of organizations are really going to struggle to make good business decisions, because these days, the way tech and business are intertwined, they're almost impossible to separate, right? And I've seen this again and again in my career where business leaders just don't understand what's going on technically, and they don't want to take the time to even have a high level understanding. Like I have a high level understanding of DevOps. I took a class called DevOps for Agile Coaches that Cliff taught, and I loved it. It was really fun. I am not a DevOps engineer, but I learned enough about it to have a basic understanding of what it is and how it works and what the job involves. And it made it so much easier for me to have conversations with my team and understand what was going on. And so I think having just that basic level of understanding among business leaders is vitally important. Okay, and then we had a couple DevOps questions. Yeah, so this is really an area where, you have to wonder, like, not you individually, not your team individually specifically, but like in the organization as a whole, if 19% of the organization or 25% of the technical people in the organization say disagree or slightly disagree to this statement, then you probably have a problem that you need to look into, because this is pretty fundamental to good DevOps. And here, let's see. What percentage of deployments to production or releases to real users result in severe problems or degraded service? The majority. Wow. Well, there you go. So now this is not a typical survey, because here we're dealing with people from many different organizations, right? So we're not really assessing anything in particular. We're sort of taking a quick pulse poll of this particular group. But the way this survey is designed, it's designed to go out to a group of people in an organization to get a sense of what is happening in that organization and what are the blockers, what are the things that are making it really hard culturally for DevOps to succeed. Okay, before I go on, I'd like to just pause and see if anyone has any questions or thoughts they'd like to share. I just covered a whole lot of material real quick.
And I think you can use the reactions or raise your hand if you want to be unmuted, or post your questions in the chat. I have a question, Lisa. It looks like your surveys drew from a couple of different resources in order to build those questions. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. So in fact, you know what, it's probably easier to just show you a slide. It'll just take me a second to jump to it. So one of the things I was going to talk about tonight was the Agile 2 values. You can read about those on the website, agile2.net. And then I was going to talk a little bit about the Agile 2 principles. But you asked specifically about the 3 tools that we use. So for culture, we use the human synergistics culture model and the assessment tools that they've developed over the last, literally like the last 5 decades. And these are really reliable survey instruments. They're statistically valid, and scientists love them because they want valid results. And I think, sometimes people don't want to use surveys because they've been subject to so many bad surveys in their lives where, the questions didn't make sense, or there was an idea that it's anonymous, but there were so many open-ended questions that people had to type in an answer to that they felt like they could be identified. Most surveys are just really lousy, right? They're not valid. And the data that they collect is kind of muddy and hard to interpret. Sometimes, nobody ever analyzes the data or takes any action after that. So the survey was kind of a waste of time. So a lot of times people have these prejudices against surveys. But in healthy organizations that really want to get to the bottom of what's going on, they really benefit from having these valid surveys done so that they can get a sense of exactly where their problems are so that they can deal with it. And so what we do at Agile 2 Academy is take a really systematic approach. And this culture model that I'm showing you here is from Human Synergistics. And what I really like about it is that it doesn't classify organizations or divisions within organizations into separate buckets. So you've probably heard of the Western culture model, which classifies organizations into one of 4 buckets, basically good to bad. And then there's many others that are similar that have, color schemes. What Human Synergistics looks at is a balance between the different things that might be in these different categories. And all organizations will have some elements of all of these because, like people, organizations are very complicated and they're not perfect, right? There's always going to be something that needs a little attention, or there's always going to be some area that needs some work. So it's not like an organization can go from red to blue. Blue is the constructive culture, which is the desirable, healthy state. But the organization can, over time, gradually have less of the aggressive defensive style, which is the red, or the passive style, which is the green, have less of those and have more of the blue, right, with the right cultural interventions. So, culture, what happens is culture gets in the way of trying to implement Agile, and it gets in the way of trying to implement DevOps. So what we do is an intense culture survey to try to identify what's happening in the culture. How are people relating to each other on a person level, right? So that we can identify, what is this wall? What's this blocker that's stopping you? And then we can use the data that we get from these culture surveys and looking closely at DevOps. Now with DevOps, it's, Cliff is a DevOps engineer and knows a lot about the topic. And so that particular survey is very technical and would go to the technical members of the organization. It wouldn't go out to everyone. The culture survey can go out to everyone. And so once we have gathered that information, then we can get a sense of, what is going on with this organization and what specific strategies might be useful to try to help the organization get themselves unstuck.
Great, thank you, Lisa. That was really comprehensive.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, does anybody else have any other questions for Lisa? I think everyone is absorbing and letting it sink in.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to go to back to presenter view. So it looks a little better. And I'll just go through quickly to share with you what the Agile values and principles actually are, right? So before I do this, I decided not to go into too much depth on how we came up with them. And I'm realizing now that maybe I should have said a little bit about that. We came up with them it was 15 people over 8 months. Starting at the beginning of the pandemic. And we just talked about all the Agile things and gradually came up with a set of ideas that we all felt reflected a healthier way of thinking about things. And eventually we were able to coalesce into a set of values and principles. And our value statements take a both and format, because we think it's really important not to think of these value statements as polarities where one is good and one is bad, but instead to think that both are valuable depending on the context. So for thoughtfulness and prescription, the idea here is that prescription is okay and useful, especially when you're starting with a brand new team or a group of really inexperienced people. And they don't need to know and understand everything at first and be able to make all their own decisions. They'll actually be better supported if they have some guidance. But it needs to be thoughtful guidance, right? And it's important to think about the idea of letting people learn and grow. And as they mature and as they get more experience, then they're ready to take on more autonomy and make more decisions as a team. We value both outcomes and outputs. We don't think it's wrong to measure outputs. They just need to be the ones that are going to lead you to the outcomes that you want. So you just don't get outcomes, right, until you have the right outputs. And so they're both really important. We value both individuals and teams. So as I was saying before, in the Agile space, it's all about teams. But with Agile too, individuals are really important. I mean, teams are made up of people, right? So individuals really matter, and what people need, their working style, their preferences, their growth and career development. These are all really important. And team spirit also matters, right? The team is very important as well. So we're not saying one is more or less important than the other, but they're both really valuable and need to be valued by the organization. Business understanding and technical understanding. So this gets to what I was talking about a little bit before, which is, you know, to succeed these days, business leaders need to understand technology, and also technology leaders need to understand the business. So we hear a lot about autonomous teams and self-organization. And I think this comes from the idea that people really need to take ownership of their work, and they have to be able to try out new ideas and learn from their experiments and be innovative. But at the same time, I think leadership is really essential. I remember in one situation where I was supporting a young team of college graduates, and they'd never heard about Agile or Scrum, and they were just starting out coding. And they were basically just told, just, you know, self-organize and figure it out. And you're all equals and just talk and sort it out. And of course, it didn't go that well, right? Because too much autonomy before a person is ready or a team is ready can really backfire. So leadership's really important, because leaders can then decide, you know, how much freedom people actually can reasonably handle and what's appropriate for them. Adaptability and planning. Adaptable leadership is really necessary today because things are just changing so fast. It just makes your head spin, right? But planning is also important. Just because things are changing all the time and we have to be adaptable doesn't mean we never make plans, right? We still need to sit down and think about things and be careful and plan out what are the different possibilities so that we can prepare. And then when things change, we need to be adaptable and adjust our plans, right? We need to be able to let go of the plans if they're no longer going to serve us. Okay. Agile 2 principles are not the last word and the final say on everything about everything, right? We don't claim that it's complete. It's not a model. It's not a process. It doesn't have step by step. It is a set of ideas. And the purpose of these ideas is to help and support and guide teams so that, and individuals and whole organizations, so that they can be really successful. So I mentioned before the Agile 2 survey items. what we're doing here is we're looking at alignment with the Agile 2 principles. And there are a lot of them. I'll warn you, if you decide to go to the agile2.net website and read them, which I urge you to do, you'll see there's quite a few. But we think that work today is complex, and especially technology work, there's a lot to think about. And it's important to be thorough and careful so that you have some core ideas that kind of back up and support what you're trying to do. So what we've done is organize these principles into some general categories. First one here is product design. And I'll give you a sample item from the product design category from the survey, which is, we personally accept accountability for product defects and their impact on customers. So again, you would get a Likert type scale. A Likert scale is that scale that you experienced when you did the little survey from 1 to 5. So you would choose, like, how much do I agree or disagree that this is happening in my organization? Another one of the categories is frameworks. And an item from our survey in that category is, we effectively modify and adapt Agile frameworks to the way we work, the task at hand, and any special requirements or circumstances. So essentially, Agile 2 is framework agnostic. All the frameworks have some value in them. They have some good ideas. They might be useful. They might be a really good guideline or not. It just depends. And it's up to individual organizations to decide what's going to work for them and make adjustments and adapt the frameworks to their circumstances so that they can come up with something that's really going to work well for them. Now, Agile 2 has a whole lot of leadership principles because we think leadership is really important, and leadership was not, has not been thoroughly addressed in the Agile community in what we call classic Agile. We talked already before about, teams needing direction. And, when you think about it, any team of any kind, of any size, at any level in the organization always needs direction, right? You need someone who is responsible for setting the vision and making sure it's well communicated and communicating well with the team. But organizations need many different kinds of leadership, and they need different kinds of leadership at different levels, at different times, and in different ways. So while Agile 2 does talk a lot about leadership, we don't try to be like the final word on leadership. I mean, you can get a PhD on the topic. There's endless books written about leadership. And, we just think it's really important to think about it and to be intentional and to be thoughtful and make sure that people have the types of leadership that they need. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that these are roles with responsibilities and titles. The person who's exhibiting that type of leadership doesn't necessarily have to be a formal leader of the team, but a good team lead will recognize the skills and the leadership capabilities of different people on the team and take advantage of those to work together with the team. So in the Agile community, we say that, leaders will emerge, that you don't really need to be, super thoughtful about it or assign leadership because they'll just emerge. And that is true in a way. I mean, leaders do emerge. If you just let people do what they want, eventually they will. But Joe Freeman wrote in a 1970 essay called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. And she wrote, "There's no such thing as a structureless group." And I think what she means here is that as soon as you put 2 or more people together, they're going to intuitively and automatically, because they're human beings, right? Based on our evolution and our history as creatures, we will organize ourselves into some kind of hierarchy. And what she says here that I think is really relevant is, as long as the structure of the group is informal, the rules of how decisions are made are known only to a few. and awareness of power is limited to those who know the rules. So I think, the manifesto's statement about self-organization was really a rejection of micromanagement. It was sort of saying, we just are sick of people getting in there and getting in our business and telling us what to do every second. But I don't think that it meant that all teams need to be self-organizing, because sometimes if you do that, a structure can emerge that's harmful, right? So we believe really strongly in intentional leadership. And, that means having leaders who are open. Like going back to that survey item we had before about having to back up the person with the most authority, a good leader will invite their team to question them, to share new ideas, to push back on things that they don't feel comfortable with, because a good leader knows that they have to be open to new ways of thinking about things, because they might need that information, right? That might be vitally important for them to be able to figure out how to go forward. And, just because you have authority doesn't mean you actually use it. And good leaders will use their authority very sparingly, right? And it is true that people need to have agency over their work. They need to have a level of an autonomy and decision-making power so that they can be really, truly creative. But when issues come up that transcend the team, problems that the team just can't solve by themselves, a good leader will know, how to intervene and take care of some things and use their authority to clear blockers for the team, or work with people outside the team to change the way that they're interacting so that they can support what the team is trying to accomplish. So a good leader will take all of these things into account, and they will also, pay attention to issues that are internal with the team. And they will also be supportive when strong, healthy leadership emerges from the individuals on the team. Another thing that is really important for Agile 2 generally is this idea of human communication, right? So the Agile community has sort of adopted a real focus on face-to-face communication, always and everywhere being the best, or if you're on Zoom, you need to have your video on. And we really don't believe that the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation. It is possible that that was true 20 years ago, before we had, iPhones and Zoom and Slack and really sophisticated ways to chat with each other about what's happening. But sometimes writing is more effective. Sometimes writing back and forth over a period of time helps a group come to a better decision in the long run than trying to get everybody together in the room and saying, okay, we need to make a decision right now. So sometimes, like, let's say you're trying to solve a really complex DevOps issue. Like you want to work out what kind of integration strategy 15 different teams should use for validating changes to their 40 code repos. A face-to-face conversation is probably not the best way to make that decision. What might work better is for someone to draft a document and put it online somewhere, and then other people take a look at it and maybe contribute a different approach, and people read that and comment on that. And then maybe they come together and have a conversation also. So, we're not saying that we think that you shouldn't have face-to-face conversation, but that's not the only and always the best way, especially when you're dealing with really complex things. And go ahead. Does someone have a question?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, okay. All right. I thought I heard a voice, but maybe I'm just imagining it. Okay. So the other things that are in the Agile 2 principles have to do with areas that were left out of the manifesto around product design, and we already talked about data and transformation. Agile 2 really focuses on products. Some of the frameworks have sort of tended to push a feature mill, but we want to get back to joining product design and product development so that they're very closely and tightly aligned. And get away from thinking of developers as order takers, as people who just get tickets from a Kanban board and just work the tickets and then take the next ticket and then take the next ticket. It's just not really the way human beings work. They need to have more conversation with each other and more autonomy, and also some decision-making power about, like, well, why are we doing this work? Why are we doing this work now? And they need to be able to bring their ideas and their creativity into the process. Okay, I am going to end the slideshow because I already talked about some of these slides. So I jumped around just a little bit. Let me go to this slide. This is my contact information. So if you want to reach out to me or learn more about it, we have this really interesting group on LinkedIn. It's called the Agile 2 group. And what's interesting about it are the types of people and the quantity of people who've jumped in there to have conversations. Many are from other countries, and they're not all from the United States by any means. And they're all different kinds of people too. Some are business people, some are tech leaders, some are software engineers, DevOps practitioners. We have some Scrum Masters and Agile coaches, a lot of product managers, business analysts, all kinds of different people trying to figure out, like, well, Agile isn't working that well for us. And so now what do we do? Like, what do we do next, right? And so they have joined the group, and we talk about the ideas here and debate them and discuss examples. And it's a nice, friendly, interesting group of people. And then there's the book, of course, and agile2.net is where our group of 15 people posted all of our thoughts and ideas that went into how we came up with the values and principles. So it's pretty comprehensive. And we have had a lot of interest even from other countries. There's some talk of translating it, we'll see. And that group of people who created Agile 2 is very diverse as well. They're not all Agile coaches or anything, right? We have some data scientists and engineers, and we have an Agile HR person on the team. So we had a wide variety of perspectives. They're all people who've been working with Agile for a long, long time, and pretty much most of them in the software, I think all of them in the software space for quite a long time. So very advanced practitioners, but very diverse from different countries, different genders. And so I think that really contributed a lot to why we were able to come up with something so deep and robust when we finalized the set of principles.
Yeah,
so go ahead.
I just had a question on one part on your talk where you're saying that actually face-to-face interactions is not always the best way. Have you faced a lot of pushback on that from certain practitioners, or on any other particular points in your updates?
Not really, to be honest with you. There are still tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, Agile practitioners out there who say, everything should be face-to-face and we need to get together in real time. And, but I think that with the pandemic and the way that so many of us are at home on Zoom, I think we're all realizing that it is possible to have very deep connections and relationships with people. I don't mean like personal relationships, but I mean healthy work relationships where you dig into some tough problems and you solve them and you discuss and debate ideas, and you use all kinds of tools, sometimes video face-to-face, but also sometimes share documents. There's a myriad of tools available for sharing information and making decisions. And, remote teams often have people in different time zones. So meeting at the same point in time is really hard. So I think there's a growing realization that there are lots of ways to communicate that are very effective.
Got it. Thank you. And then Daniel also had a question. He's unmuted so he can.
Yeah. You gave us a list of, I think it's 6 or 7 dichotomies, 6 or 7 things that you want, and thoughtfulness and prescription, outcomes and outputs, and so on. Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's something missing from that list, which is, I feel like the things you've talked about are kind of missing the biggest thing I see that's not working in Agile. And I'm going to say that the thing I'm missing here is it's not all culture. You need culture, attitude, whatever, all that stuff. You also need structure, responsibilities, and roles. The biggest role, it seems to me, is missing. And I don't think this is particularly an Agile thing, because it's missing in waterfall, organizations as well. I've done some writing and some coaching of writing and teaching of writing. And the longer I'm a software developer, the more I've realized how much similarity there is between writing good code and writing good anything else. Good fiction, good expository work. And if you are running any kind of, if you're putting together an encyclopedia, you don't attempt to do it without an editor. There's almost no venue where you write without an editor. And I think a lot of the things you're looking at here are the things that an editor can help with. The biggest disconnects, the biggest wastes of effort and money and time that I see come from kind of code that's been written until it works, but not until it's been brought together to make a whole base of code that the company can continue to mine and create value from going forward. It works, but it works differently from the other guy's code. It's not well factored. So none of the nice innovative things in it can actually be reused anywhere else. It's not well factored, so it's fragile. So we end up spending a lot of time fixing it. And a lot of that stuff about fragility, about proper factoring and so on, which is so core to the Agile, code writing. I think the more I've worked with DevOps, I'm coming out of being a pure coder and, working more and more in, trying to get that whole team together where everybody works on the whole process from sketching out the initial classes all the way through to the deployment in the in production. That those ideas of solid programming and so on, and understanding how to factor things are challenges throughout the whole process. And an awful lot of the time we waste, an awful lot of the things that break, an awful lot of the things that are 17 times harder than they should be are because they're not well factored, not well organized. Right. And I really feel like, the biggest thing that needs to be addressed in Agile is this role of who is responsible for stepping back and, saying, well, that's great, but you shouldn't be injecting that right when you create your base container. You should be doing that at the end of the process in order to reduce coupling. And similarly, an editor isn't just somebody who comes in and tells you, hands you back your paper with red circles on it. Although they do that. It's also someone who coaches and mentors individual developers to better understand what the structure of a good document is, as well as coaches and mentors, developers or writers, I'm using those words interchangeably now, to write in the particular house style that is required for where you are now, even if you don't think that's the best way. So I've thrown a lot of stuff out there, but that's kind of what my problem isn't structure. My problem isn't culture. My problem with the places I've worked, I've worked some places where I had problems with the culture. I just